call it that.
It's very unusual. Very unusual, you can't hear this, I do apologise. So, we're just saying we needed some really good stuff to keep us awake after we put a sandwiches after lunch, and we did that by having two fat people. So Kevin and Tara, who have gone from being the people thrown out of council chambers to the people who are actually working genuinely in partnership, I hope we're going to hear, Hammersmith and Fulham. So really excited to hear what you guys are doing and how you're taking the world over. That's good stuff. Can you hear me? Alright, great. So we've been asked, oh, I've been echoey, sorry, it's a bit odd. So we've been asked to speak today about how it's possible to realise co-production at a strategic decision-making level within a local authority. And Trisha's right, Kevin and I are both in our DNA, disability rights activists, have kind of like fingers, so to speak, in all sorts of sectors, and both kind of, I think, grown up within the disability rights sector. But we are now, and I have described it as going to the dark side. I'm working for London Borough of Hammersmith and Fulham, and we're going to talk to you a bit about how that happened, what change looks like, and how it was, sort of why we chose co-production as opposed to other traditional approaches to good old community engagement, and the impact that that's had, I suppose, going forward. So in place, I'd say, and I think that's because it requires systemic culture change, and all of you in the room that are campaigners for social change know very well that culture change is probably the most difficult to shift, but we are getting there.
Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Great. So the key things we're going to talk about today are what we mean by co-production and why it's different in Hammersmith and Fulham from what's gone before. And we all know that co-production is a misused term. There's lots of kind of academic and kind of research aspects to co-production. And what we're trying to work with the council is to really practically implement it. The second thing is the history of disabled people campaigning in the borough and why that was so important to where we are from where we started in probably 2006. And then Tara's going to talk a little bit about the Disabled People's Commission and the recommendations, which are all about co-production, and why a Disabled People's Commission as a mechanism for bringing people together to work together, so councillors, residents and staff, is what's really important about the Disabled People's Commission. And then we're going to just talk a little bit about the framework that we've got for realising co-production, and then just give you some examples of some of the work that's already started.
All right, thanks, Kevin. So I thought we'd be quite useful to start with what we mean by co-production, because as Kevin said, lots of people are using that word, I think, to misrepresent something, or at least describe what people have always done, which is kind of like talk to disabled people right at the end of a process and said, this is the decision we're going to make, do you like it or don't you? And if you don't like it, then we just won't speak to you again, we'll just crack on and implement the policy or the service anyway. And I think the reason why at Hammersmith and Fulham, this was before Kevin and I started working at the council, we've only been there since, God, it's nearly a year actually, since April. Before that I was chairing the Disabled People's Commission, which I'll say a bit more about later. But we decided that if we were going to have an opportunity to fundamentally change something, we know from evidence that disabled people are furthest away from the decision making, locally and nationally. So this was an opportunity to try to change that, and we thought co-production was the route to do that. And I'm going to read it because I've got a terrible memory, but what we mean by co-production is where disabled residents and decision makers are working together in an active way to plan, design and review policy and services that affect our lives and to get rid of the barriers that we face. So that's really absolutely embedded within the social model of disability, which is what we focused on.
So, as Tara said, before all of this, we were both involved in a grassroots campaigning organisation called Hammersmith and Fulham Coalition Against Cuts. And in 2007, we initiated a judicial review against the then Conservative Council for reintroducing charging for home care independent living services. And that administration was elected on a manifesto commitment not to reintroduce charging. So it really was red flag to a bull to 3 months after being elected to start consulting residents about implementing a charging policy. But it was that kind of process and we lost the judicial review and we lost the appeal. But what that process did was really get people to take notice of local disabled people campaigning and challenging. After all, local authorities are spending our money and our resources, and we weren't having any say in how that was being determined. So so from the beginning, disabled residents have been challenging the bad policy and decision making, and focusing on building political and community allies, as we've done, to support disabled people's rights and equality. In 2015, we set up a network of disabled people's organisations across the borough. We are only 3 organisations, but traditionally those 3 organisations worked in silos. We didn't work together. We didn't necessarily understand each other's aspirations and priorities. So we're working with local safety net people first, and so that's another really important step. But I think the key message is that without the campaigning of those organisations and challenging authority and public decision makers, none of what we are talking about today would have happened.
I think that's right. So after the 2015 local elections, the new Labour administration decided that it wanted to have greater accountability to the community. So it set up a number of resident-led commissions, and the Disabled People's Commission, I think, was the 8th or 9th commission that was set up. Prior to that, there had been an Air Quality Commission, there'd been a Poverty and Worklessness Commission, dreadful title, a Business Commission, but the Disabled People's Commission got started in September 2016, and I agreed to chair it. Kevin and I are both residents of Hammersmith and Fulham too, but I agreed to chair it on the understanding that we had complete autonomy in terms of what we were going to think about, who we were going to talk to, what we might recommend in terms of change, and also that the commission would be properly resourced so that we could reach out and recruit a diverse range of disabled residents, which is what we did. So 10 disabled people, including me as the chair, and I guess we started out really a real range of people, real range of experience, and I think lots of people in the beginning got a little bit caught up with sort of wanting to sort of what I would describe as tweak around the edges of change, so do a little bit maybe around access to pubs. In Fulham, someone wanted to do, now I live in Fulham, I think that's a great idea, but for a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity of the Disabled People's Commission, I thought access audits of local pubs, I could do that in my spare time. But we decided early on that if this was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, we need to go for something big. And like I said before, we knew for sure that disabled people feel and are furthest away from the decision-making process and feel they have, feel invisible within our local communities, never mind what's going on nationally. And so we did think about co-production because we thought it would be a fundamentally new and different way in which the local authority would engage and work with, in partnership, disabled residents. And I should say we focused on disabled residents first because we're all disabled people, but everything we've recommended in our report, and I think, well, we have a link anyway, but we're happy to share copies of the report afterwards, that that everything we recommended would work with any community, work with any marginalised community, that it's not rocket science. So there were 10 of us, and we met for about 18 months. We did surveys of the local community. We had lots of people come in and talk to us, including senior local authority staff, just to understand, because I'd never worked for a local authority. I have never worked for a local authority, and now I do. I've worked in the voluntary and private sector, and what I do know is that they are pretty bureaucratic beasts. So I think we all needed to understand how they worked. And I think really from day one, the local authority were very supportive of what we were trying to achieve. And in December 2017, the report went to full cabinet. I presented it to full cabinet, and it was accepted by everybody, including the opposition, all 8 recommendations, which is extraordinary. And I think we are the only commission where that's been achieved. So that's a huge, it is a huge opportunity for disabled people. The report was published in June 2018, so 18 months ago. Fully accessible report, and the council have used it repeatedly as an example of how they should be writing their reports. So the idea was that we would not go down the age-old route of the kind of like the standard version of a report and then the easy read summary. The only report that is available publicly is the easy read version. And that's an important point, and that's an important message in terms of the inclusivity and the accessibility that was at the heart of the Commission. So, 2 secs. So in terms of our recommendations, we started with the approach of taking a social model approach to our work, i.e. focusing on the barriers that disabled people experience to decision making, to accessing services, because those, I don't know if there are any local authority people in the room, but we all know traditionally it's about a deficit model, what disabled people can't do. No one has a conversation about the barriers that we experience. But we wanted to, I suppose, reframe the conversation so that the starting point was, what do local authority services need to do to remove the barriers that disabled people experience that enable us to have at least some degree of equality within our local communities. And so since the publication of the report, they've appointed to a senior strategic lead for co-production 2 disabled people. That would be me and Kevin. But they've also set up a Hammersmith and Fulham co-production implementation group, which is, I'm guessing it's unique. It's a combination of disabled residents, counsellors and senior staff who are all working on, I suppose, turning those 8 recommendations into an action plan. So how do we turn those recommendations into real change within the local authority? And I think we've always the recommendations are strategic, and I think they follow each other. I suppose they set out the framework for how you get to what the situation is or was last year to how it needs to be if we're going to realise co-production. So we start with a shift in culture. The council, unbelievably, has signed up to taking a social model of disability approach. They've also signed up to taking a human rights approach and embedding the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. I'm saying that kind of almost like disbelievingly, because where else is that happening? Now, signing up is one thing, the doing is a whole different thing. We know that. We're not living in cloud cuckoo land. This is a long process, but getting the sign up, first and foremost, surely is crucial. Then building the capacity of council staff and councillors, but also the community to know how to co-produce. So we can all talk about co-production, but what support do we all need to make it happen? So Kevin and I now are working on some resources for the council to be able to, I suppose, practically do co-production. Now, none of this is going to be perfect. We are going to make mistakes, we have to accept that, but we always have to learn from those mistakes. And I think it's interesting, we're really pushing against a local authority culture that is quite fearful of making mistakes. And we all know where that comes from, but we're not going to make change happen unless we really, well, not always make mistakes, but at least learn from mistakes. I think there's something really important about developing some really strong communications about why the council believes in co-production, why the council now believes in achieving equality and rights for disabled residents in our community. There is also in recommendation 7, it's probably, I think it's probably the most important recommendation because it talks about strengthening the role of disabled residents and disabled people's organisations at a grassroots level to be the, I suppose, the change that they need to be to make sure that the resources are there, that the support is there, and I suppose that they are at the table, not just with regard to disability-related conversations, but right across the piece. We are holistic individuals, after all. We're a long, well, I'm not going to say we're a long way from achieving that recommendation because it's, I suppose, in this good old age of austerity, we are constantly having to make the good old business case for why funding needs to be placed where it needs to be placed. But Kevin will talk to you about some of the successes that we've had with regard to funding. And then also really thinking about how services need to fundamentally change how they support disabled people to live in the communities in the way that we want to live. So thinking about how we might co-produce a quality assurance framework with disabled residents. I'm not going to, there's lots to talk about in terms of the shift from adult social care to independent living that Kevin's going to talk about, but I find it extraordinary to see what probably to me as a sort of like disability rights campaigner have been the sort of like the enemy, that the local authority, the statutory people who have always felt one of the biggest barriers to my equality and my human rights, to actually be having conversations with these people about how we're going to make change happen together. I think it's extraordinary. And then the age-old thing about budgets, how are we going to fund co-production? So we're just going through a process of getting each department within the council to set aside a pot of money to co-produce with disabled residents on the issues and the policies within those individual departments. And you know, I'll be honest with you, we're live streaming, that wasn't the most difficult conversation either. Because I think if the council strategically is committed to co-production, then with that needs to come to the resources to make it happen. It's a political commitment, so therefore it needs supporting, it needs funding. And then lastly, independent monitoring and evaluation. How will we know that we have made progress? It's not just the fact that Kevin and I are working at the local authority, and I'm thinking just being present is making a difference, but what does it mean in terms of disabled residents in the community? How are things different, and how will we know that things are different? So those are the 8 recommendations, and we are working our way through them. Some, you might imagine, are moving more quickly than others, but I think we've made astounding progress in independent living.
Just to carry on from Tara, so where the co-production has started, the early impact, well, the general buzz and profile of disabled residents has really gone up through the roof in the last 2 to 3 years. So while we were very low down on the agenda, we're somewhere near the top finally. Disabled residents, for example, have been working on the redevelopment of Hammersmith Town Hall and the surrounding area. That's a big public project. But unlike previous projects, we've got 6 disabled residents working as part of the team. So they're part of the team to working with architects, planning and regeneration officers, so that we will have a town hall that is inclusive and accessible, and a legacy to the work of those disabled people that are taking part in it. So that is a huge difference. That's a huge difference for the architects, the way that they're working with us. That's a huge difference for our planning and regeneration officers. And we had a voter registration campaign that was targeted at disabled people and supporting disabled people around voting. So we had a huge poster campaign with 3 disabled residents on 3 different posters, and that's quite significant, again, just the general profile raising around the borough. So the council also has agreed to shift from what was a kind of non-co-produced personalisation strategy to a vision for independent living defined by disabled people. That is, we're kind of doing the work with staff and to be able to kind of launch that hopefully sometime this year. But that is a huge shift for the council, there's a huge shift for residents, and it's a huge shift for our staff. And people are really excited because actually disabled people know what barriers we need to have removed. And if that's the kind of guiding light and the driving force for public sector policy and service provision, then you're much more likely to be pleasing everybody all round, staff, residents, councillors particularly. We had an independent review of our direct payment support across the borough, which was carried out by an external disabled people's organisation from another borough. The social care department is implementing all of the recommendations. They were all accepted by Cabinet as well. And now we have a co-produced direct payment improvement plan based on Article 19 of the UNCRPD and Article 33, and that is in our service specification for the service. So that also, we think is probably a first. And the direct payment service contract was awarded back to Disabled People's Organisation in the borough just in January, and that's been a struggle to get that back in the hands of disabled residents, and that's been an 8-year campaign. So a lot of the things that we're talking about are not quick fixes, and it takes a lot of commitment and investment. We've also had disability equality training from Inclusion London for all of our councillors, which that's amazing. All of our councillors have had good quality disability equality training, and that hopefully changes the way that they look at council decisions, council reports, processes that come in front of them, that they have a different prism at the way that they look at what they're agreeing to. We've also trained 250 frontline adult social and children's services staff and all of our senior management teams. So I hope we're making it sound like it's easy, because it really isn't. And we have made huge gains, and you all probably know that we're the only borough in England now that doesn't charge disabled residents for home care services, independent living. All independent living fund packages were ring-fenced in 2015 to 2020 when the government closed the independent living fund. So we have real political commitment for this, and it's not just tokenism, and I think me and Tara would not be working in the dark if we didn't really believe that this was possible.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm conscious of time, and it would be great to have some thoughts and questions from you, but I think Kevin's right, this has not been easy, and it feels like every day that you make, I know it's a cliche, but kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, sometimes 3, and you leave at the end of some days and you think, oh, why have I done this job? But then others, you think there is change happening. There is change happening because other people are talking about co-production in the way that Kevin and I would be talking about it. So the kind of like the message and the aspiration, crucially, is spreading, I guess, there is something about being in the tent, isn't there? There is just something about, but sticking to your principles, but making sure that the structure in which you are working starts to share the same principles. And I think it's interesting, in a matter of years really, not that many, less than 10, where Kevin and I were in meetings with a council leader who said, you're all living in cloud cuckoo land. You disabled people who think that you'll have an end to home care charging, that will never happen. 2020, well more than that, we've had free home care for 2 years, 5 years, a long, long time, and the only local authority in England to have achieved that and to continue having a political commitment to that. And I do think that comes from the beginnings of co-production with disabled residents. And I think we're a long way from the good old tipping point. And I think we will always have to make sure, disabled people in Hammersmith and Fulham, that things don't start to drift, things don't start to go backwards. But I suppose the message from us is just, even in what feels like awful and hostile political times, change is still good change is still possible, even after the turmoil of the last sort of months and 3 years. Change for the good is still possible, as long as the people who benefit most from that change, disabled people, in terms of this issue, are at the heart of that decision making, at the heart but also at the start of that decision making. So we're going to stop talking, but we'd love to have some questions or any thoughts, feedback. Come and visit us in Hammersmith or Fulham, for example. Over to you. Do we need a roving mic or something?
There's a second mic. There was 2 mics. There it is. You silence people completely. That very much.
I have to yell. It's just a point of clarification. When you talk about disabled people, are you talking about older people as well as disabled people? Brilliant, because some people separate that out.
We don't.
And I think it's absolutely fantastic that we've got auxiliary care and beacon to the rest of all the local authorities. So thank you very much.
Yeah, after today we will circulate a PowerPoint presentation which has a link to the report, and the definition of all disabled people in the report covers older people, has a wide-ranging definition of what that
And children and young people, and we don't distinguish around impairment or health condition. It's people who experience barriers. Everyone's very quiet.
Thanks very much, Tara and Kevin. One of the things that we talked about earlier was trust. Trust, because a lot of trust has been diminished. And I speak here also for Tom, who's here, Tom Griffiths, who talked also about justice. Now, it's very difficult to recognise trust and justice within statutory services. How significant is trust and justice, do you think, in Hammersmith and Fulham, and how significant is it for you in terms of continuing the work of co-production?
I mean, just initially, I think the part of the big work starting around the Disabled People's Commission was building trust, because it's more or less gone, and even with a positive local authority like ours, people have lost so much in terms of, for example, the number of social workers that we've got has diminished hugely since 2010. The kind of practical things that people may have had some good relationships with staff and have gone. So building trust has been really key, and I think the the great thing is we've had feisty public meetings where people have been able to vent. Really, we've just let people come and vent. But the fact that in the room at those meetings are counsellors, me, Tara, senior staff, all in the same room, listening to the same. Usually you have a meeting with counsellors where people say things, or a meeting with staff where people say things, and you rarely get all of us all together at the same time. So I think that trust is starting to be rebuilt. And for example, around direct payments, people want the direct payment support service back. They've got it back. So we don't charge people because it's discrimination. So the trust will come more and more as the co-production activities start to accelerate and more things look like things that people want and feel like things that people need, and that's so the trust building is key, but it's going to be a process.
I think when I first started chairing the commission, trust was a real issue for me. I think because I'd had 15 years at the Alliance for Inclusive Education with some really difficult government meetings where there was no trust on any side and there was just deep suspicion. And I think I brought a lot of that kind of feeling into the commission. And I started off by thinking, well, maybe as disabled people we should meet on our own. We shouldn't have any council people in the room, we shouldn't have any councillors because we want to have our own kind of like conversations ourselves. But I was persuaded that actually the way we were going to sort of like, if we were going to really achieve change, then there needed to be openness and trust from the beginning. And what was really interesting was how quickly there was a shared trust thing going on. And we had some real honest conversations, as Kevin was talking about, with councillors about what they would need to be able to support this kind of change. And what they got from us was a well-evidenced, well-written and, I suppose, strategic report that shows them step by step the change that they need to make. But I think the justice issue is that, you know, we have a leader of the council currently, Stephen Cowan, who has talked about home care charging as a social justice issue. But that came from conversations that he had with disabled residents who were being subjected to the double taxation of home care charging. And so there's an understanding that home care charging is a social justice issue, as is the exclusion and the inequality of disabled residents. So there is I think there is a kind of a deep-rooted, particularly within the political leadership, I think, of an understanding about what needs to change to enable kind of like justice to feel kind of like real for all residents. I think there is just, for me, there is just a huge job to do in steering a local authority whose culture is so set. And this is not unusual, is it? I'm sure every local authority is the same because they're such big bureaucratic beasts. It's quite a job to steer them towards that kind of approach. But we keep saying it, that we just being there and having conversations, and we've been very clear from the beginning that we haven't been employed to just nod our heads in agreement at meeting. We're there to interrupt, but in a positive way, not just to be a pain in the backside, but to genuinely offer solutions from our own experience as disability rights activists about how change happens and about how change needs to be inclusive of all disabled people.
I just think as well that the leadership of councillors is extremely high, and they see their role as facilitators of change. They don't see themselves as power brokers, and so that understanding about their role is really crucial, because that means that we can all work together quite well, and that's probably fairly unusual.
Have you got any literature, or have you got somewhere I can reach out? And because I'm going to contest some financial charges and I'd like to be able to steal your material.
Listen, this is for sharing, it's not stealing. This is about collaboration. Huh?
Borrow it. Well,
yeah. Use it. So, listen, we'll just send it to. Yeah.
Can we send it out? We'll send it out. Anybody who's been today and wants stuff that we'll send out, we'll just send you a bunch of stuff and you can delete it.
We've got a PowerPoint, but we've also got the report, which I really suggest you have a look at, because honestly, it's really accessible. It's a good read.
And I just think the main message from today is, for example, take the report, because that's 2 years' work by disabled people with a set of recommendations that you can implement anywhere. So take the report and use it. So, for example, Lewisham Council has just announced its Disabled People's Commission, which they've just in the process of, it's just getting off the ground. But that's on the back of the report and the work that we've done in the Hammersmith and Fulham. So I think it's justifiable for everyone to say to their local authority, if they can do this in Hammersmith and Fulham and they can do this in Lewisham, where's our real mechanisms for co-production, and use the report and use the recommendations to show that it's possible.
I get the impression that a lot of what's happening in Hammersmith and Fulham is still a work in progress. How far along that road do you think you are?
Oh, God, that's a tricky question. I think it might depend on the issue. So, for example, I think culture change, they talk about the social model of disability. They talk about, in the new vision, the independent living vision, it quotes Article 19 of the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. Those suggest to me that we're moving in the right direction. The transformation away from personalisation to independent living is a huge move in the right direction. But I think what we're still setting up is the independent evaluation mechanism that will help measure or answer actually your question in a more specific way, because I think some areas of work progress more quickly than others. Like we're still a long way from getting children's services to think about the realities of inclusive education, for example. But what we're doing is linking inclusive education, quite rightly, to independent living, given it's one of the 12 pillars.
I think also, so we're just about to start facilitate a staff network for co-production leads from each department. So we'll have a kind of decision maker in each department and an operational person, and me and Tara will facilitate that group, and then they will be the igniters of co-production in their departments and departmental working. So the next phase is getting really the staff working around co-production and the resources, and we've got a checklist for co-production. We'll start to give the leadership within each department, some operational people focusing on co-production, the financial resources which we hope will be in the next year's budget, so that we're not having empty networks that have no resources to do anything. So I think the next phase is going to be much more practical, and we should start to see more impact.
One more question, then.
I just want to pick up the point you said about initially you didn't want to invite the council in, you wanted to keep it to yourself, but you persuaded to let them come into the conversation. You found that beneficial. I just wonder what success you had persuading people within the council to invite you and others into their decision-making processes, especially when it comes to budgets and allocating resources, because increasingly I find examples of closed doors when it comes to those sorts of conversations. They want them to be invited into your conversations, but want to exclude the community from their conversations, because that's how the world is.
Yeah, or that they want to ring-fence those conversations on very narrow parameters. Do you know, honestly, I think there is something about the fact that we have a senior role. I think if we, and what I've discovered with, about a local authority is incredibly hierarchical, the kind of chains of command, it's just extraordinary. And I think the fact that we are at a very senior level, you could just open the door and say, we're coming to this meeting, and this is what we're going to talk about. And you'll make progress or you'll not make progress, but what you have with that seniority, whether we like it or not, is power to push and power to challenge. And I do think that has helped getting us into conversations that ordinarily, as you rightly say, would be very difficult to access. And I think what we then start is an opening up of that door. So I think recommendation 7, like we've already talked about in the report, is crucial, isn't it? Because there's one thing about Kevin and I being one post at the council, but how do we build that capacity? Yes, it is through the staff network, but we also need a kind of like a unified force of disabled individuals and disabled people's organisations in the community to say we must be at the table as well. You cannot co-produce without us, and that's the fact of it.
And I just think that the really hard bit is building the relationships and getting people working together. And so our implementation group is fantastic because there's about 10, 12 of us, but it's an example of councillors, residents, disabled residents and senior staff working together in the same room consistently. And that's the model we want to get working across the council. So, so half the battle is building those relationships, and obviously many of you will have experienced that disabled people are often seen, disabled residents are often seen as some kind of pressure group or agitators, or but we all know that campaigners usually have the best solutions, and so trying to glue that divide together and to show that it is possible to, the good thing is we get staff asking, can we just come in and sit on your co-production meetings, because we can't really envisage how councillors, senior staff and residents can work together because it's so unusual. So anyway.
Thank you so much, pair of you. Real kind of inspirational food for thought. I think there's a few people around the room who've got a bit of fire in their bellies to go and see how we can make this stuff happen. So fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm saying this without asking you, but if you're up for hanging around, we do have in the next session, remember there's the one session which is kind of like open space again, chance to do some thinking. So if anybody, it might be that you kind of hang around and have chats with people. Yeah, fantastic. Brilliant. Right. So, afternoon sessions then. That's now. So these afternoon sessions will take us up till 3:30, where we get a short coffee break, and it will just be 15 minutes, and then we're back in the room, please, for 3:45 for the final session.